All right. Well, thank you, Corinne, and thank you everyone for taking the time to come. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. All right. So we have a friend that just jumped in, so I'll go a second. Hear the doorbell sound.
Yep. Yeah, it looks like they came in. She was logging in.
All right. Okay, so my name is Danielle Klein, and I am from the Planet Bee Foundation. So we're really excited to share with everyone our kind of hybrid program. It has virtual components as well as some in-person for local schools. But also as we go through it, so being a small group, please feel free. There's a lot of information that'll go somewhat fast as I kind of go through our program and how we teach it and the opportunities we have for teachers. But if you have any questions or any ideas, feel free to put them in the chat, or don't have to stay quiet. Feel free to interrupt me or share at any time. So our goal today is just to kind of share our program and talk about STEM in general in the classroom and different ways that environmental STEM in particular can be brought in. I'm also going to give you like a taste of what our lessons, and the resources that we have available for teachers. So after, in the next couple of days, I will follow up with Corinne with an email. You'll have access to all of our open source materials that are online, as well as registering if you would like for any of our video lessons or virtual lessons. We are really, really happy that we have received grants to provide our virtual lessons and professional development to like all Bay Area schools as well as most of the country for free. So we can do all of our lessons at no cost. So if you have any interest in signing up, please do, because we would love to work with some of your classrooms and or do some professional development too with your schools. And again, it's at no cost. So Planet Bee, we are a San Francisco-based environmental education nonprofit. We teach about the bee is our kind of launch pad or springboard into environmental STEM in general. That way, it is a very tangible topic for children. So climate issues, environmental issues are very heavy. It's very challenging even for adults at times to have conversations about and to work through, and can be very overwhelming to kids. So by focusing on a bee, number one, bees are struggling. They do need our help. They are an important organism. So it makes a lot of tie-ins to the students' lives. They're also relatable to kids from all backgrounds and walks of life. So whether they have an urban environment or more rural, you can always count on the fact that they have seen a bee in some regard. As well as bees are, small, they're cute, and if you can start to care about organisms as tiny as a bee, and you kind of start to feel empowered by the fact that you can be part of helping with all of these issues instead of just feeling overwhelmed by them. So it's just a relatable way to bring STEM and environmental ed to kids of all ages. Because our lessons that we're gonna kind of go through, our lessons go all the way really from pre-K to 12. We have different presentations, different levels of each lesson. We have 4 lessons, as you'll see, and they work with all grades and build on the topics that we have in different ways. This is just an example of some of the next generation standards that go with our lessons. Tonight's presentation kind of goes over a mid-range. So there's a peek at some of the high school, a little bit of some of the younger kids. Most of the slides you're going to see are in our 3 to 5 range, just because it's kind of in the middle ground. But if you have interest in seeing a preview of some of the lessons at some of the other grade levels, please just let me know. And we also have full list of the standards and topics for every lesson. They meet next generation Common Core as well as California state and many of the other state standards. Okay, so our first lesson and our first activity that we teach, we have 2 that are based on honeybees, and we have 2 that are based on native bees. Beometry is one of our honeybee lessons. I'm sure you can guess what type of math goes along with beometry instead of what it be geometry. Okay, so you may not have realized how much math bees really do and how mathematical and smart they really are. And so beometry takes a look at all of the math that is used inside of a beehive in its creation. So again, depending on the level of the students, many know that there is a hexagon in the cells of a beehive, but understanding why becomes a challenge even for older kids. And then for the younger kids, it's a look at shapes and even just identifying a hexagon. So as we go through some of the slides again, these are just a taste of our lessons, the different concepts that we're going to work on, especially the math ones, work up in a progression for the kids, especially younger ones, so that we do not just dive into math problems. And you will also see along the side those boxes. They're just listing some of the standards that are met by the different parts of the lesson, as well as some of the cross-curricular tie-ins that you could use some of these lessons for. So again, not just focused solely on environmental ed, but also bringing them in for some of your character ed, the idea of working together as a hive, solving problems together as a team, or into, your reading topics and your math topics for the academic skills that are covered there. So we go through the jobs of a hive, who really realize that bees really are busy. They do a lot throughout their lives. They work their entire lives. For younger kids, we have them act out the jobs. So very interactive. For older kids, we have the jobs kind of appear one by one and have them compare them to human communities and human jobs of how we all work together. And we talk about efficiency and conservation of resources in this lesson is a big part of the lesson, especially efficiency. Bees have a limited amount of time, a little limited amount of energy, just as we do, and they have to be efficient with the resources that they have, and especially the wax. It takes a lot for them to make wax. It takes a lot of time for them to shape those cells. So they need to make sure that it's not wasted. We look at what the cells hold, what they're used for, and the students make a claim as to what shape they believe the cells will be. So at this time, you want to take a guess of what you think. You can put it in the chat, but you can be the students and make your claim of what shape you think the cells are in a beehive. But the cells, many students do start to say at this point, well, I know it's a hexagon, but again, we go through a progression of why that hexagon is the best choice for the bees and how that efficiency ties in. So we take a look at the most common shapes that are listed, and I know some of our friends took a guess of a circle. We've had some other ones too, hexagons, things. So we look at triangles, squares, and so it works through that scientific method and reasoning and problem solving as we go through a progression of why some of the shapes work and some of them don't. We take a look at, we have a list of characteristics. They have to be strong, they have to fit together tightly, they have to have an area that allows for the storage of materials like food and the brood or the babies, as well as be efficient in the use of the wax. With the older kids, we go through perimeter. With the younger kids, we keep it to just what the shapes are. With high schoolers, we get into a more complicated area. The area of a hexagon, especially, is a little bit more complicated formula. But once we look at the perimeter and size of each shape from the outside, we look at the fact that it has a hive is not a singular cell. So we take a look at the cells and how they work together. Again, this is the end of a progression of leading up to it. The kids get to see that when you are looking at the triangle, you only have to make 3 sides a couple of times after that, because they build upon each other, that you get to make less and less sides in different parts of your cells. So really, out of this whole grid, you would make 43 total sides. So leading into that efficiency of you don't want to build more sides than you have to. When we go to the hexagon, it doesn't look too good for the hexagon when you see that you don't have to make 6 sides very often, but they are still a 6-sided shape. So ultimately you will make 81 sides. However, the hexagon is saved. Again, it's a progression for the kids. It's not this fast, and they do a lot of thinking and problem solving along the way, a lot of questioning as to what's going to happen, because many know it's a hexagon, but it doesn't look good for it. But when you take a hexagon and a triangle of comparable sizes, hexagons are able to have shorter sides. Even though they have more of them, they are shorter, and the area is comparable. So you ultimately use less wax because your sides are shorter, even though you're making more of them. When you multiply it out, the amount of wax used is less than even, say, a square to have a comparable size area. The sides have to each be longer. So ultimately, the hexagon wins. The hexagon, after we go through our characteristics, we are able to evaluate that it is stronger, it does hold the space, and it does use an efficient use of the wax cells. So you have the maximum amount, and I know one of our friends shared in the chat that hexagons maximize their storage space, and they do. And we look at with the older kids too, at the fact that those slanted sides displace the weight, which adds to their strength, instead of like a square or a rectangle that doesn't have the center support and may collapse. So then we take a look. Always, we like to tie in, of course, the bees. Again, we use them as a launch pad or springboard into other topics. So we like to compare them, where hexagons are also used in other parts of nature. They do come up in the scutes of the sea turtle. You can see they appear here. We also have the kids work through we show them a video of an experiment where they can blow bubbles with dish soap into a dish. The bubbles eventually go from being round to hexagon as they need to use their space. So again, just kind of reiterates the fact that you need that efficient use of space, and that hexagons work for that. So that one was just our biometry. Again, that was just like a short glimpse of it. The actual lesson is about 80 slides. So there's a lot more progression and building up to those topics, but I don't know if anyone has any questions or any thoughts on that lesson before we take a look at some of our other uses of bees in environmental ed. Don't be shy. Feel free to share. Was advantage to being small group. But the next lesson we'll look at is Do the Waggle, which is our other honeybee lesson. And it is based on communication, as well as, again, the mathematics that bees use to communicate where to find food. So we start out, we always compare, especially with the younger students, the organisms, the bees, to human life. We talk about communication and how humans communicate and why, and lead that into how other animals communicate and why. As we talk about, many kids point out the fact that the cat in the middle looks very angry and that they would not want to mess with a snake. But we talk about, inferring and coming up with what the animals are trying to say, what cues they're giving with their facial expressions and things, and their body language, as well as what their sounds may mean, before we kind of transfer into the bees and what the bees talk about and how they talk about it. So we take a look at their antennas and the fact that their antennas are used for communication, like our ears and our nose. They use them to smell and sense the environment around them. So they talk about everything from air quality and temperature to food, which is mostly food. And we compare that to how we share information about our favorite restaurants and our favorite meals. Everybody Instagramming their dinners these days. And how the bees, that's basically what they're doing when they're doing the waggle dance. But the waggle is very mathematical. It goes through a process of to tell the direction and the distance for food, as the bees need to communicate and find food sources for their survival. So we get into angles, we get into directions, we get into measurements. Again, it depends on the age of the kids that we're looking at, which path we take and how simple it is. It also is good for math reading, and compasses are part of this lesson. But the bees, they actually have 5 eyes. So they are always oriented to the sun. They have the 3 eyes up in their antennas, that they always know where the sun is, and they always angle themselves accordingly. So when a bee is flying to a flower, they know at all times what angle they are from the sun and their home. So when they return home, they will waggle or dance in the same angle as the food that they found. So if they found food at a northwest angle from their food or from their home, or south, if they had to fly east, they know that, and they will waggle accordingly. So as we work through this lesson, we learn more about who lives in the hive. We talk about the caste of bees and their roles within there. So a different look at it from biometry. But we have one of these is the queen, one of them is the worker, one of them is the drone. The kids are first shown the pictures without any clues. They take guesses, then they're given a few facts like these, and then again asked to reevaluate their guesses before finding out who is who. So if you want, in the chat real quick, you can tell me, who do you think each bee is? Which one is the queen? Which one would be the drone? Which one would be the worker bee? You want to take a guess? It's always a lot of fun discussion with the bees and the casts or types of bees, because the boys are always saddened to find out that 99% of the hive are the girls, that the boys, there's very few of them in a hive. The girls always celebrate the fact that the girls do everything, the boys don't do anything. And if, depending on where you live, if you're in a colder climate, the boys are kicked out of the hive for the winter, because all they do is eat, and the girls don't like them eating up the food source through the winter, so they are pushed out the door. But okay, so we have our guesses for 1, 2, and 3. So number 1 is the worker. It is the smallest bee of the hive. They have to fit in all of those small cells, as well as all of the flowers when they are out foraging. Number 2 is the queen. Her abdomen is very large because she does carry all of the eggs she will lay in her entire life, and that is 2,000 eggs per day. The number 3 is the drone. His flight muscles are very large. That's why his thorax is very large, and his eyes are very large. The one thing a drone does is go on a mating flight once in their life, and so they have to be able to fly very, very quickly to catch up with a speeding queen. But other than that, they don't do anything. And the drones also lack a stinger. So kids always want to know who stings them. The boy bees cannot sting. It is always the girls that sting. But with the older kids, we take a look at not just the fact that antennas are used for communication, but what those antennas look like. We get into the parts of them. They are actually fairly complicated, which the high schoolers really get into the parts and the anatomy of an antenna. But they have different parts that are used for different jobs. So again, it kind of lends itself to how the kids, are used to our different, adaptations and body parts and the jobs that they do. We also compare the honeybees to the native bees. So kids a lot of times think that all bees make honey or that all bees have always been here. And so it's a great use of those reading and ILA skills of the comparing and contrasting and finding the differences. Honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought here in the 1700s for their pollination and their honey. Native bees have always lived in this area. That's why they are native to our area and North America. And they do not make honey. They live in wild, solitary lives, which we'll take a look at in the other lessons. But honeybees live in large colonies of up to 50 to 80,000, which is always fun to ask the kids if they'd like that many roommates. Many think they would until they start kind of thinking of like the mess and the jobs that they'd have to do. And it's one thing when you have a couple of siblings or a few other housemates, but it's be a lot after a while. And we look at the comparison of wasps to bees. The fact that a lot of kids are always curious if they are the same, and they are not. So like when you're having a picnic, the ones that are bugging you and can sting repeatedly are the wasps, where the bees are much friendlier. We always say that they are naturally vegan. So they are after only the plant pollen. They don't have any interest in you. Where wasps, because they are carnivorous, will steal bits of food and they can sting repeatedly, which makes them a lot more of a pest. We look at the anatomy of bees and their biology. Again, with the younger kids, it's more simple. This is a middle school slide. It is presented to the kids clear at first with just what parts do you know? And can you guess? This is the answer slide, where after using the word bank, you can see where everything would go. Then we get back into the waggle. And now that we have a better understanding of bees in general, the waggle dance again is very mathematical. It measures distance. Every kilometer that the bee flies is 1 second of dancing that they will do when they are back in their hive. So outside of the box or outside of the hive, the bee flies to its flowers to forage. It will return to the hive and waggle in the same direction. We use the curved lines. It's just a visual that the kids can count for their waggles. So this bee flew 5 kilometers, so she will do 5 waggles when she returns to the hive. She will dance for 5 seconds in the same angle and same direction as she flew on the outside to tell her friends where the food is if they are hungry and would like to go get a snack. And then we just kind of go into like the facts of honey. Everybody, honey is a great source for us nutritionally. It's a very healthy sweetener. But a lot of what the bees go through to make it, so just again, is that building that appreciation for an organism and the importance of bees as we all learn to care for them and look out for them. So it's always fascinating to the kids to find out, if you think of that like 1 pound bare jar of honey that we're all really used to seeing in stores, what it takes to make that is about 2 million blossoms worth of nectar and pollen. So that's the lifetime work of like 600 some bees, since they only live for about 4 to 6 weeks. That is just a taste again of the waggle. We go through a lot of different problems where the kids are shown a bee and shown a flower, and they identify the direction that the bee would be flying in, calculate how many waggles they would have to do. The younger kids, the older kids, we have a harder time getting them to actually show off their waggle, but the younger kids are always very willing to stretch and show it off. So we definitely give them the opportunity though. But those are both of our honeybee lessons and how we bring the world of honeybees into everyday classroom activities and everyday academic skills. Does anybody have again, any questions, comments, feel free to share. Feel free to stop me. I don't mind not being the one talking. But okay, so our other two lessons are both based on native bees. So even as adults, the world of native bees is not quite um, as well known. Honeybees tend to get a lot of the focus because we do enjoy their honey. We've just kind of interacted with them more for a lot longer period of time, where native bees are extremely important pollinators, but because of their solitary lives, we just don't see them as much sometimes. But the famous one of the native bees is the bumblebee. That is the most recognizable of all of them. Our native bee lessons actually start with a fun video that's just a couple minutes long, but it really shows the diversity in the native bee species. There are over 4,000 species, and it showcases that there are blue ones, green ones. The smallest of them is a perdita bee, which is a bright yellow. It does not look like a bee at all, and it's about the size of your fingernail on your pinky. So it is a tiny little bee, and she's adorable. So really like showcases the wide range of species and diversity, which again lends itself very well into the character education, as we're really trying as a society to teach kids to, embrace their differences and embrace, cultures. It really works well as you show how well all of the bees embrace life and embrace each other. So we talk about the differences of the honeybees and the native bees, just to kind of give that context. We had lots of vocabulary building, again, depending on the ages, but even the older kids, it's just different vocabulary. We talk about the fact that native means to be where you are naturally from. We compare it to polar bears because, again, they're just a very recognizable species. And then we go into 4 main native bees. So again, they're not presented to kids all on one slide. It is a progression even with the older kids because it's a lot on a slide. But we focus on the mason bee, the leafcutter bee, the bumblebee, and the carpenter bee because they are recognizable native bees that are prevalent throughout North America. So we do teach across the United States. I'm actually in Pennsylvania. We even teach way up into the Arctic. We work with schools that are in very isolated parts of the most northern regions of Canada and Nunavut. So we pick out bees that can be found by a lot of students pretty much anywhere. But we look at their contributions to pollination. We look at the foods that they bring to the table. We look at our reliance on them, and we look at their habitats. So there are clues, and there is a test in just a minute. So if you look at carefully and consider some facts, the mason bee builds its home out of very much like the mason human, out of clay. So the occupation of a mason that works with bricks and clay. The mason bee is found mostly in the Pacific Northwest because they like that clay. The leaf cutter bee, they do not eat the leaves, but they cut them with their jaws to roll up and use in their tubular shaped homes. The mason bees again stuff their tubular homes with their clay that they find. And the carpenter bees use their very strong jaws to chew on wood. And bumblebees use the ground. They are very hardy bees, and they are one of the only native bees that will nest with other bees. They actually will build small colonies of about 50 to 100 bees. They can have a queen, where other native bees do not, but it's still nothing. Even their 100 friends in a home is a lot less than the 50,000 bees of a honeybee. And then the question of bee cams and observing bee behavior. There's a lot of videos of bees and what it looks like inside of a hive. Don't particularly know of a way to like actually watch them like in real time. That would be a really good idea. But there are lots of video resources out there that do show like the comings and goings of bees, and our lessons have some of them in them that will show, what it looks like to pull frames from a honeybee hive and how it looks in a native bee house. We have an activity that builds native bee houses and shows what that looks like, which we'll look at in a minute. But so after looking at the native bees and kind of talking about their houses and where they live, the kids get to test their knowledge, see if their listening antennas have been tuned up and working, and see which bee would live in each home. So if you want, you can be the students and tell me where you think they would each live. Now, B and D are the same house, but if you look very carefully, you will see that in slide B, that image is focused on a tube that is stuffed with a green material, where in image D, they have stuffed it full of a very brown material that is prevalent after the rain. So if anyone wants to take a guess of which bee would live in which home with the kids, depending on their situation, if they can, we allow them to annotate and kind of mark it. They share in the chat. They tell us where they think they would live. But anybody think they know who would live where? Who might chew a hole with their strong jaws into wood? Who would live in the ground and between the grass? Yep, so we have our carpenter bee would go to letter A. Our mason bee is D. The bumblebee is C. And the leaf cutter comes over to B. So again, we work through that with the kids, and they actually have a lot of fun with the guesses and trying to figure out who lives where, and trying to figure out which home is which. Then we talk about how our lessons focus on the fact that, with climate change, with different things going on in the environment, the bees are definitely affected. Their habitat, they have lost a good bit of habitat between human decisions as we expand our cities and towns. Especially native bees are affected more than honeybees, because honeybees can be raised in large colonies domestically. Native bees, you can't really do that. They are experimenting with native bee houses, especially the tubular ones for mason bees, and leafcutter bees have been very successful in helping them. But there are many native bee species that it's harder because you're not able to raise them in a colony. So we do talk about the climate change a little bit and the impact that it has on the bees, but we really like to steer more towards how you can help the bees and how you can be part of the solution and what kids can do even with small choices. And one of them, this is an activity, these are still shots from a video that we show. And many teachers do request this video for a separate activity. Makes a great follow-up activity after our lesson, and we gladly will share it. But it works through making a native bee home out of a paper grocery bag and a water bottle. Also, waxed cartons work very well too. So it's taking found objects or things that we would normally recycle and putting them back into use as a habitat instead of trash. But after watching the video, we have a discussion with kids. There are some parameters in building it. And again, we do gladly share this video if you want to make them with your students. It's a fun hands-on stewardship activity that brings that kind of empowerment of, helping the bees to life. And then we look at what life looks like inside of it. So this is inside of a bee tube. So this is from some photos of inside of what the home would look like. So native bees, the females, stuff the tube full of nesting material. They lay their eggs and they leave bee bread as the first baby food for the bees. Kids love when they find out what it's made of. It's 3 ingredients, which is pollen, nectar, and mama bee's saliva. So that always leads to fun discussions of, if you would like your parents to fix your food that way, but, since Mama Bee doesn't have a kitchen and can't stir, she has to mix up the food a different way. And it gets kind of creative with what the kids' answers are there. But that bee bread is what sustains the larva as they grow until they emerge as an adult bee that's ready to go out and pollinate. Then we bring in how far a bee will travel. So again, just understanding that appreciation for bees. This chart's presented blank to the kids. They start with predictions of how far a bee will fly. They don't really think they fly all that much typically. Usually the guesses are very low, and surprisingly, as we work through the math. So again, with younger kids, we keep it very simple. We just look at the bumblebee, and we keep the math part very easy. With the older kids, we have them actually do the calculations when they're given the information on the left. They give it a try. And then looking at the fact that, a bumblebee will fly up to 1,680 miles in a month, which is a lot for those little wings. And we also like to throw in the fact that it takes a year's worth of flying. 13 bees in a year's worth of flying can go around the globe. Or if you compare that to humans, it takes 30 some humans to the average distance that a human walks daily. It would take 30 of us a year's worth of walking to go around the globe. So they're definitely covering a lot more ground than we are, but we also like to ask the kids if this is where the distances they're flying to get food. And we always ask the kids, would they want to have to go this far each time they wanted a snack, which is always a no. But then we go into, again, this is just one of the fun challenges that kind of reiterate things to the kids. If we could not rely on the bees and they would not help us with pollination anymore, how would your food sources be affected? What would your picnic look like? What foods would we lose? So if you want to take a guess and help me out, what would we lose from our picnic if we could no longer rely on the bees? So again, this is after kind of talking about, what foods each type of bee pollinates. But anybody want to take a guess as to what foods may disappear from our picnic or just change? Maybe they wouldn't disappear, but they wouldn't be the same tasty treat we are used to. Yeah, definitely the fruit is going to go. It's always one of the first to be eliminated. The kids try very hard to hold on, like to the pizza, try all different kinds of angles. Pizza, you technically could keep in some way. Many grains for the dough are wind pollinated, but you would lose your sauce because that is pollinated by carpenter bees, and bumblebees pollinate tomatoes. So you would lose your sauce, you would lose a lot of your toppings, as well as your cows that make your cheese for your dairy. A lot of them rely on foods that are pollinated by bees, so that would be affected too. The kids also try really hard to hold on to potato chips, but they are pollinated by bumblebees. Bumblebees are the only bee that can pollinate potato chips. So if we ever lose bumblebees, potatoes would follow not too long after because they use buzz pollination, which they are the only bee big enough and strong enough to do. Potato plants hide their pollen extremely deep. Hot dogs is usually an argument with the kids as they try to say there's no way a hot dog would change, but you would lose your toppings and you could have your actual hot dog unless your animals were relying on the bees for their food. But there's a lot of herbs and spices in a hot dog that we don't really think of. We don't eat as plain as we think we do. So it would not taste the same, and you'd have a roll with a kind of a unflavored hot dog. Apple pie, you could keep your crust, but you would lose your apples, you'd lose your cinnamon, you'd lose your vanilla, which is also what would change in your chocolate. Chocolate, cocoa beans are not pollinated by bees. But again, we don't eat plain cocoa beans. They are actually very bitter. We sweeten it with things like vanilla and creams that are hazelnuts and things that are pollinated by bees. So your chocolate bar would be around, but it'd be not the same as what we're used to. So we always challenge the kids too to try to come up with other foods that they think would not be affected by the bees. It always ends up being coming down to, well, we could have water, we could have some seafood, but a lot of our other diet would change. Even, kids always throw out sushi, but a lot of sushi has, again, herbs and seasonings and things in it that do rely on the bees. So just really brings home the fact that we need the bees. And we look at the fact of how much a bee can pollinate in a day. Again, these are blank. The kids help work through the math. That bees do pollinate about 2,000 blossoms in a day, which can pollinate up to about 100 trees. And that can produce about 150 apples, which can go into about 15,000 apples really by an orchard, which can feed about 1,500 families, which is really just from, that's one bee pollinating in a day. So when you calculate that by thousands of bees, that's a lot. And then we really try again to tie the lessons into as many connections as we can make with the kids, and really bringing it into as much of an appreciation, like whole body experience as we can. So this is one of our favorite activities, where everybody looks goofy for a minute, but it's fun. And that we challenge the kids of, could you keep up with a bee? We have them flap their wings as fast as they can for 30 seconds, which we can do. If anybody really wants some exercise right now, we can flap our wings as fast as we can. But yeah, see, time us, but they even as many times as I've done this, I think my highest score I get to like 45. Not that very impressive at all. The kids will always throw out huge numbers, but the reality, after we all kind of share and make our data table and see where we are after 30 seconds of flapping, a bee can flap its wings about 200 times per second. So after 30 seconds, they've reached about 6,000 flaps. And we realize that we're not anywhere near keeping up with them, and we're much better off staying humans. But as we work towards helping the bees, we go into, planning a garden. If you were going to plan your garden, what would you put in it? So it's just a fun project. With the older kids, we actually look at, areas and perimeters and what size of your garden and the amount of space a plant needs. How many could you fit in, and what would you do? With the younger kids, we keep it simple of, if you could plant anything that would feed you and the bees, what would you do? So it just kind of gives that stewardship piece of helping the bees through small actions, but that also provide healthy snacks for us. And that is our first of our native lessons. That was wannabe. Our other native bee lesson is adaptability. But before we move on to that one, if anyone any questions or anything, comments, thoughts, even if you pop up with any ideas that you think we should add or would be great, it's always good to know. We're constantly kind of revising and adding and changing.
I added a couple bee cams that I just Googled really quick.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'll stick those in the email out next week too as a follow-up. But
Thank you.
If you guys are looking in the chat, there's a few there.
Good. Always good to have those resources. Personally, I made a lot of videos. I have 2 hives in my backyard, so I cheat and go for them. But it's always good to know where other ones are too. Adaptability, as it sounds, goes into adaptations. So again, that looks different depending on the ages of the kids, but just the idea that we've all adapted and evolved to survive where we have and where we are. We compare that, to adapting for the seasons. This lesson is fun in that it goes into life of the Arctic bee. So where you really don't think bees are, native bees are on every continent except Antarctica, but even our friends that we teach up in the far reaches of Canada do have bees. So if there's a flower, you can have a bee. But we look at adaptations. This one is fun because we have the kids try to pick up something without using their thumbs, which is an adaptation that we rely heavily on. We just don't realize it. So it's always a fun thing to see that you can do it. It's just not as easy. Then we look at, other living animals, what adaptations they have to survive. We look at adaptations from two categories. We look at behavioral and structural adaptations. So those body parts that are part of your structure that help you to survive, as well as the behaviors that we do to survive. Then we bring it into the bees. And again, native bees really lend themselves well to the diversity and the adaptations. You can see, these are 4 native bees, but they are extremely different. These are 4 of them that are in our video that this lesson would start with. Everybody loves the blue one, especially since you just don't really think of them being that color. And as we tie into, why bees have simple adaptations, like why would one bee be hairy and the other one is bald? Why in such a species would you have such diverse beings? So we goes into, this is from the older kids, that we go into the actual evolution of bees and how they have co-evolved over time with flowers, back to a time when there were no insects and pollination was not very efficient when it relied on the wind alone, to the fact that flowers and bees have kind of helped each other out through time. Insects evolved and flowers evolved, so that now flowers, these are what flowers look like to a bee. So where flowers, again, originally were very dull in color, they have evolved to be targets for the bee. If you are a bee looking at that yellow flower, you see that bright red bullseye helps to lead you in to find that nectar and pollen. So it's a reward for the bee that they get that nectar and pollen and their food, all the way to it helps the plant that relies on that pollination for the survival of its species. So we go into, that co-evolution piece. Again, that's a part for the older kids. With the younger kids, we keep it more simple. We also look again at adaptations, like the Arctic bee is able to fly at much higher altitudes than we would expect. There's actually some of these things that the Arctic bee can fly higher than. So if you want to take a guess at which ones the Arctic bee can surpass, you can share in the chat, but how high do you think a bee can go? And with the older kids, this lends itself to some fun math as we kind of calculate some of these things. And yes, it does surpass the Eiffel Tower. Yep, it will fly higher than Mount Logan. Actually, the only thing on here that the Arctic bee has not been found to surpass is the cruising altitude of the plane. So Arctic bumblebees have been found at altitudes of about 9 kilometers. So they beat all three of these on here. The plane is the only one that is flying higher. We look at the hairiness of bees again and how that serves the purpose of warmth and also pollination and carrying that pollen. We look at how different bees, they all need food, they all rely on pollen, but how they go about it is very different depending on their species and their habitat and what climate they are living in. We let the kids decide, would they rather be hairy and carry their pollen, have a crop, which is that internal organ, or we also look at pollen baskets, which look like very puffy pockets on the back legs when they're full. And the kids always like to say that they would rather have the baskets, which we call pollen pants. Then we just look at the fact that the bumblebees and their buzz pollination, then we get into how light and temperature affect the bees. So these are from the younger kids, where the older kids, we take it to be fractions, parts of the day that are sunny. The bees need at least a minimum of 4 hours of sun to be active. With the older kids, we get into elapsed time and calculating on a given day, is there enough sunlight for the bees to be active? We get into temperature. Bees need to be at least 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And we look at the fact that they can buzz. Just by buzzing, they can raise their temperature 60 degrees. So on a day that is very cold, with the air temperature being only 26, because they have the adaptation to buzz and raise their temperature, they can actually, on a very cold day, still be active, which is how they're able to survive in places like the Arctic. Then we look at the fact that these adaptations have happened over time and that they are passed down through the generations. And then we look at the ecosystem as a whole. So all of our lessons end bringing it all back to the ecosystem as a whole, the reliance on each other. Again, this slide would be blank except for the pictures. The kids would make the connections. Even if they can annotate, they draw the arrows themselves, or we do it for them, but they lead the discussion of how these animals and organisms rely on each other, rely on the sun, rely on the water. They are always trying to get someone on this page to eat the bee. None of these organisms really eat bees, but we do share with them that one of the biggest predators of bees is very smelly, and that is the skunk. Skunks will eat bees. But that the bee is pollinating habitat for a lot of these organisms. Again, we do bring it into climate change. We do take a look at the fact that climate is a factor in the bees and why we need to help them and look out for them. Deforestation, expansions of our urban areas. But we always, again, bring it back to how you can help. So all of the ways that kids can help, everything from just avoiding pesticides and chemicals to leaving leaf litter on the ground, which kids love because it's an excuse not to rake the lawn as thoroughly, to just even taking the time to learn about the bees and then share what they've learned with others so that we have an appreciation for them as a whole. But that is a lot of everything in a kind of a quick time, but thank you very much for listening and joining. And if you have any questions about bees or our program, I'd be happy to answer it. We will follow up again with all of our online materials and how you can access all of that. We have lesson videos that you can do yourselves if you are interested. We have student handouts and crafts and games. And then we also have our virtual lessons and professional development. So these lessons that I previewed, we can teach to all classes at no cost. All you have to do is register and pick a time that works for you, and we would be happy to join your class. We do it both with kids, that are logged in individually, as well as being put on a big screen in front of kids. So any way that works is good, and it's always a lot of fun. And how long is each class? It depends. Each class, if we teach it in its entirety, takes it's like 45 to 50 minutes. But again, they are really interactive. We let the kids get up and dance, flap their wings. But sometimes they do go a little longer if, depending on the kids, we let them ask a lot of questions and talk a lot. So the chattier they are, that adds time. But we can also shorten them. So we do shorten them for like different bell schedules and things if you need it shorter, or if you like the younger kids, kindergarten, we usually try to keep it to 30 minutes, except for their questions. But other than that, so yeah, it's a lot of fun. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out through email, and I'll send all of our things along in the next few days. And I know Corinne always does a great job of following up and helping me with that. So
we try.
But yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to ask or share, reach out. If you have any suggestions too, anything you would like to see in a lesson, let me know. Be happy to always adding ideas and changing. But yes, thank you very much to everyone for taking the time to